you could gain control or, take control of your free time or just your time so that you have free time and, maybe spend time doing more of the things that you really enjoy.
English poet John Milton depicted the devil as Lucifer, an angel who started a rebellion on the grounds that God is too powerful. Kicked out of heaven, this charismatic rebel becomes Satan and declares that he'd rather rule in hell than serve in heaven. Milton's take inspired numerous depictions of Lucifer as an ambiguous figure, rather than a purely evil one. Milton's Lucifer later became an iconic character for the Romantics of the 1800s.
Hello everyone and welcome back to English with Lucy. Today we are going to talk about self-introduction, the answer to that dreaded question, tell me about yourself. Now, to some of you, this topic may seem very basic, but learning to introduce yourself properly is incredibly important. You might need to introduce yourself without any forewarning, so you need to be prepared. You may need to introduce yourself in your English class or in a job interview. You might need to introduce yourself at a new
Treated as a pawn in international politics by both the French and the English. America's first foreign issue to deal with was the French Revolution, which began in 1789. Many Americans, including President Washington's Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, supported the French revolutionaries as it echoed their own revolt against the British monarchy. Washington and his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, were hesitant to get involved in the foreign conflict because they did not believe the new nation was strong enough to fight a war. To make matters worse, the French Revolution eventually sparked another war between France and England. In 1793, President Washington issued a proclamation of neutrality.
Secondly, it had to balance a relationship with the English-speaking world, and by that he meant the United States, but also what were then called the White Dominions, places like Canada and Australia, for example. And it also had to balance those two things with its relationship with the European continent. And Churchill talked in terms of a united Europe, which was a Europe that was united for others, not for the UK, but the UK had a relationship with and was invested in. What we've seen subsequently, and since Britain joined the European
when they translate from French to English, and you code it up in what are computer versions of sentences. And if you do that right, so is the idea, then the machine will have that human expertise. That's the symbolic AI approach, right? That human intelligent behavior is a problem of knowledge. If you give the machine the right knowledge, it will be able to do the problem. But there's a different trend. It says, look, forget about trying to tell the machine how to do it by giving it the knowledge. Just show the machine what you want it to do and get the machine to learn.
And welcome back to English with Lucy. Here's a question for you. When you learn another language, when you start to learn English, what is one of the first topics you want to learn about? Apart from swear words. Food and drink, obviously. You tick them off, you learn the basic vocabulary, and then you forget about them. I want to bring them back. Today we're going to learn food and drink, C1 to C2, advanced level. You may have seen I've just done this with daily routines. That was so fun. We're going to do it again, but with food and drink. In the daily routine,
learn English better through watching a series. So, let's get started. Step 1, choose the right TV show. There are two things to think about when watching a show. The first step is to choose a TV show that matches your English level. Consider shows with slower dialogue, clear pronunciation, and simple plots, especially if you're a beginner. Funny shows like sitcoms are often good for this reason. But also, pick a show that matches your interests. If you enjoy it, then it
One of my favorite ways to cut down on study time is to use AI tools. This is where Grammarly can help. Just open up Grammarly and ask it to help you to brainstorm topics. Then tell Grammarly what your essay is about, and almost instantly it'll give you a handful of topic ideas. Once you have your topic, Grammarly can also help you draft a research plan and even give you an outline. Now once you have the outline, you start writing your essay, and along the way, Grammarly ensures that your writing is clear and concise. It'll check for common grammar mistakes like passive voice, subject-verb disagreement, and misplaced modifiers. But it'll also analyze your piece as a whole and provide suggestions for cohesion, flow, and tone. In fact, with Grammarly Pro, you can indicate the exact tone you'd like to go for, whether it's personable, confident, empathetic, engaging, witty, or direct. Oh, and once you're done writing, you can also use Grammarly's plagiarism detector to ensure that you can submit your essays with confidence. Grammarly is a must-have for all students.
TIME is the most used noun in the English language. We can't get through the day without talking about time all the time. I think about how we use time when we actually talk about it. If you say, meet me at 7 p.m., no one panics. No one says like, oh my God, what are you talking about with these esoteric concepts about 7 p.m.? You know, we all know what to do operationally. Time in some sense is just a label on different events in the universe. The universe happens over and over again at different things we call moments, and time helps us tell the difference.
Show you one of my favorite tools when it comes to practicing English and especially English pronunciation and fluency. Okay, let's take a look. So go ahead and go to youglish.com. Youglish.com. And what this is a tool that YouTube has provided us where you can go and look for different accents and find videos that show that accent. So you can do the US accent, American English accent, you can do a British accent, or you can do an Australian.
Here, you notice right away all the English. Every crawl is like more than 40% just English. German, DEU. See, the index is here, you know, it's about 6% every time, which doesn't sound like a lot, but yeah, it's kind of a lot. But look here, 2023, FIN, Finnish. A lot of pages, but it's just 0.4% of the entire scan. This bookstore, it's got an inventory problem.
A lot of the focus is on only a very small set of languages. There was a paper that stated that
to explain to you why you need to use transcription in English if you aren't doing it yet. See, English is not a phonetic language. This means that if you look at a word, you can't instinctively know how to pronounce it. In a lot of languages, there are certain rules that really help you. Like in Spanish, you just need to know a couple of things, but generally you can pronounce a word that's in front of you because you don't have like the same letters pronounced in 20 different ways. But that's the case with English. In English, when you look at a word, you can guess how to pronounce it. And over time, you're going to get...
Let's go. Hi, I'm your business English coach, Christina, and welcome to Business English with Christina, where you become better at English and better at business. And before we get into today's lesson, did you know that I have a very exciting 5-day challenge starting very soon? It's going to be 5 live videos, you and me, with my favorite 5 smart and surprisingly simple tips to help you boost your English now. It's totally free, so don't miss it. And you can sign up for the challenge in the link down below.
Vikings. First they raided, then they invaded, and they defeated the English kingdoms until just one remained, Wessex, the wealthy kingdom under the control of Alfred the Great. Alfred was nearly captured at a Christmas feast in 878 when the Vikings launched a surprise attack, but he escaped to some marshes, burnt some cakes, so the story goes, and drove the Vikings out. He then started calling himself the King of the Anglo-Saxons, but King of England? Not quite. You see, the Vikings were still in charge of great chunks of England when Alfred died.
Just like kind of boring, middle of the road English. I mean, it's London, I guess. I've weirdly been told that my American accent, which is just what comes out when I do an American accent, I've been told I sound like I'm from Ohio, quite consistently. I don't even really know what that means, but I do know that Chris Columbus, who directed the first two Potters, I think he's also from Ohio. So maybe in some way I am just kind of mirroring the American accent I heard the most growing up, but my own accent is just boring, boring English. Who, Daniel Radcliffe? Who does Daniel Radcliffe support? I'm assuming this means, you know, in terms of sports and not like emotionally. I have become
and have some serious overlap with English morality plays. They're allegorical dramas concerned with virtue and vice. Autos were supposed to focus on the mystery of the Eucharist, or communion, and how bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ. But topics varied a lot. Trade guilds staged plays at first, then cities took over, hiring professional troops and encouraging playwrights to create new scripts. In Madrid, which became the capital of Spain in 1560, 3 or 4 autos were produced every year, usually a mix of new plays and revivals. The plays were performed using elaborate
معي أنت الدنيا فيها أكتر.
More stressed. Generally, in English, the latter word in such phrases is the word that gets most of the stress. Now, another interesting thing to look at is how it sounds. So a lot of times these words are connected not just in the meaning, but also in the sound of the words. What do I mean by that? You'll notice that in a lot of cases, the two words begin in the same sound. For example, black and blue, safe and sound, live and learn, mix and match, drink and drive, trick or treat, right?
To add to the complications, most Germans didn't speak any English, and the British didn't speak German. The language barrier was hampering rescue coordination. The American intelligence officer was a German linguist, but just as he arrived, British Army firefighters were rushing into the building. As they entered, the roof collapsed, trapping them and killing them instantly. The local German fire brigade finally arrived with their trucks. The American intelligence officer translated between the British Army and the German fire brigade as they struggled to fight the fire together. The cold temperatures meant that fire hydrants were.
And as an English teacher, we get to open that up for students, and we get to invite them to see those two perspectives and to celebrate both perspectives in our classroom.
Yes, that's from the first English lesson you ever took, and you were expecting an advanced English pronunciation lesson today. Well, let me tell you, you're not going to be disappointed, because it's starting out basic, but we're going to get advanced, very advanced, pretty soon. Let's go. Now, have, of course, you can contract it. I've got a pen, but there is more. What about in questions? Have you got a pen? You know that. But, and here's where it gets difficult, when native speakers are...
All right, let's go on to common English frustration number 2, which is, I want to speak, but I don't have anyone to speak with. Well, good on you wanting to speak in English. You know that it's important, but how can you really find someone to speak with? Well, the solution is you can learn English and speak in English right now from home. Yep, it's true. In 2022, the YouTube English lessons that you loved the most were part of a speaking series where you got the chance to practice speaking with me.
Whereas with English, that's not good enough. With English, there's a feeling that I have to be almost like a native speaker. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, Steve. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. No, I'm looking forward to talking to you. You do very important work. You teach English And in particular with English, you often hear about people who are afraid to speak or think they don't speak very well, and yet these are people who have spent years and years with English. And so I ask myself, there's more resources available for learning English than any other language. So why is it that these people still feel not satisfied with their level in English, in your opinion?
Time you step outside of English to take Chinese, the language that you think you're learning because you know the words, suddenly a hat is a man and the moon is a girl, and you think, why? It starts with making a division between things that are flat and round, or things that are male and female biologically in some cosmology. But then culture changes, the sounds change, nobody's thinking that way anymore, but you've got these labels that stick to things, and next thing you know, the table is a girl, and you can handle it. The baby can handle it, the toddler can handle it. By the time you're a teenager, you start to realize
world. In English, we can use the same word for two different feelings. If someone says, I'm sad, do they mean crying in the corner, or depressed, tired, and staying in bed? Those are both sad, in the same way that the sky and ocean are both blue. But if a child only knows the word sad, they've not heard of despondent or listless or morose or ennui, well, the underlying emotions are still different. They can still tell whether someone's grieving the devastating loss of their cartoonishly large lollipop, or whether they're just tired and generally down. Having the different words is really helpful for expressing yourself, but they don't determine your ability to.
Is the root of our word in English, vocation. And in the world in which I was born, vocation was very narrowly equated with work and job title. But we are not called merely to be professional people. We are called to be friends, neighbors, family, citizens, lovers of the world. And just as there are callings for a life, there are callings for our time.
In English, what is the structure of a sentence? What? Sentence structure. Oh, I really don't want to talk about grammar. Oh, come on. We're doing a lesson. What do I need? I don't know. A subject and... a verb. A verb, good. And what else? An object. An object. Please get an ambulance or something. Yeah, an ambulance. Great idea. I'll phone a helicopter or something. But first, that sentence.
With the experts at English Heritage to learn more about how Roman baths ran. A site cared for by English Heritage, and I'm joined by one of their properties historians, Andrew Roberts. Andrew, great to see you.
Hi.
And what a site.
Paper books, and I like to vary that content online and paper. Even books in English. For example, the professor whom I mentioned at the beginning, Stanislas Dehaene, I saw him online, but I also bought the book. I've mentioned before Daniel Willingham, Outsmart Your Brain, but I also end up buying the book. So I think it's important in reading to use the advantages of online learning, but it's also a good thing to read paper books. And it's a good thing to read a variety of sources on the same subject, rather than trying to beat yourself up in trying to remember this word or trying to remember this date. If you read 2 or 3 different books on the same subject,
which is available in English y en español. We'll start with basic questions, like what's the purpose of an IEP? And then we'll move into specifics, like how IEPs can help with behavior as well as academics. And what to do if you disagree with the school. This show is for all kinds of parents, whether your child has had an IEP for a while, or if you're just starting to wonder if something might be going on, like ADHD or dyslexia. We have info for parents of younger kids and older kids, and kids who are learning English as an additional language. So if you want to learn about IEPs and how they can help kids thrive, I hope you'll join me this season for Understood Explains. Listen to
and fear and disgust are basic level categories in English. Now, on the one hand, people have argued, well, language is just the tool that's used to communicate the experience. Yet, enough research has been done over time to suggest that the words do have different meanings in ways that are important culturally. The evidence suggests that only about 22% of languages around the world have a word that is roughly similar to the English language word fear. And really only 13% have a word.
But the English text states that the Rangatira cede to Her Majesty the Queen of England all rights and power of sovereignty.
Those big differences, one version saying you ceded sovereignty, the other one saying actually you get to govern yourselves and look after yourselves. You know, it's quite fundamental really in terms of how things rolled out across our history.
Within a Maori worldview, within a Maori philosophy, it's not actually possible to suddenly decide to give up that sovereignty to someone else.
The British proceeded to
likely to use it for the nurse vowel in English.
I just arrived from Germany.
But what is my main concern? My main concern is have to learn how to
In Germany, Austria and Switzerland, people speak different varieties of the German language, but most of these people will share the same characteristic accent features when speaking English. The speaker in the next clip is a
ask, because in English it's sort of crept in. Oh, that must be a scary thing. And things aren't scary. People are scared. It's different. The thing is just the thing. Whether you choose to be scared, some people are afraid of spiders. Some people are afraid of mirrors. Some people are afraid of open spaces, confined spaces. But that's just your reaction to a thing that exists. You can choose to be afraid or not. And if it makes you afraid, why? Why does this make me fearful? Maybe there's a danger there I shouldn't be confronting. I am never going to be a tightrope walker.
Prepara las maletas, ella está allí.
Where are we heading to?
It's always سعادة.
سعادة من هورايزن مصر للتنمية العمرانية. عندما تكتمل السعادة بجودة التفاصيل.
رمضان يعني لمة، ليبتن يظبط أي لمة، ليبتن بيظبط الكلام.
And therefore it's hard for them to recognize it in English. As a result, this completely changes the meanings of words. Compare. Ear, year. Oak, yoke. In English, the y consonant is found at the beginning of many common words. Do your best to practice words with this sound as often as possible to learn to recognize and pronounce it correctly. Nice. Time to...
Later, when people started translating the Bible into English, they adopted the same practice. Instead of spelling out the divine name, they translated it as Lord, spelled in all capital letters. Okay, you got that? Good, because there's more. Ancient Jewish scribes wanted to prevent anyone from even accidentally saying this name aloud when you read the Hebrew Bible. And so they came up with a visual device to remind you to make sure you say Adonai. They took the 4 consonant letters of the divine name. These letters correspond to our English letters Y, H, W, H. Then they inserted the 3 vowels from the word Ad.
But obviously it also sounds exactly like the English word flesh, and a lot of this collection, whilst touching on fencing and also arguing and fighting, is to do with the body and queerness. It is the meeting point of all of these things. And it's also about being bilingual as well. And I mean that in two different senses. So the literal sense, so speaking Chinese and also speaking English, and speaking those languages in different areas of your life. And she uses Chinese letters throughout this collection to illustrate that in a similar way to Raymond Antrobus using.
If that person is familiar with British English expressions, maybe they won't feel like you're being rude, but I recommend in the US, do not say, I can't be bothered. You might hear this in British English, but in the US, don't use this to decline an invitation. I can't be bothered. It is not an Americanism. It sounds quite odd in the US. All right, let's go to our next category. What should you do when you want to tell or ask someone something briefly? Well, some people just live with their husband. Some people raise kids together. Some people raise...
This lesson today is all about natural English expressions that you can use in everyday conversation. I've got 13 idioms that will help you to express doubt and uncertainty, which is really useful, right? Because we don't always have all the answers, do we? I don't care who you are, you don't know everything, you don't always know exactly what you should do. So these expressions are going to help you in those moments. And we'll focus on 3 different situations where these expressions will be useful for you. Firstly, when you're still thinking
into the wilds of the English countryside. It's absolutely fascinating, and it has similar themes to English Animals by Laura Kay, but it's written in a very different way, because in English Animals I felt really up close and personal with all of the characters. In this book, I do feel like we get to know Rachel, but there is this divide between reader and character. It is like we are observing her and studying her as she studies the wolves. It's almost like we're doing some kind of, not experiment, but definitely a study, as if she is a wild creature herself. So I enjoy.
Lucky us, I can write a book with a title like Stuffocation in English or Ontspullen in Dutch, and instead of people thinking these are ridiculous made up words, they get it, because we all have too much stuff. So what I believe in, and this is all backed up by science, I should probably mention that, is that what we need to do is have a revolution in our thinking, shift our thinking from being materialistic to being experientialist. Instead of thinking best place to find happiness, identity, status and meaning is in things, in stuff, in material goods.
Here to help you speak English with clarity, confidence, and to feel freaking proud about who you are and how you sound in English. So be sure to subscribe and click the bell to get notifications. Let's begin. As an English learner, you must have asked yourself in the past, what is the best way for me to improve my English? Should I start with grammar first? Should I focus on pronunciation? It's all about vocabulary. Phrasal verbs. If you master phrasal verbs, you got it covered. I just need to go out and speak for 6 hours every single day with native speakers. No, I should speak with non-native speakers only. I should take a private teacher. It's all about joining online.
Perfectly positioned on that border, he spoke English and Gaelic. He could use a sword on this side of the Highland line, and he could use a pen on that side of the Highland line. He reared cattle and drove them south to market each year. But more than that, he'd collect other folks' cattle and drive them with his own. Traders in the south would commission him each year to deliver a certain number of head of cattle. He'd source them up in the Highlands, and then he'd take them south, receive payment, and duly pay the Highlanders whose cattle he'd sold.
عشان ماما ملكة الإنجازات، زانوسي سهلتها على كل الأمهات.
His mother and father were immigrants with an English and Scottish heritage. He had a Scottish nanny. He traveled extensively across Europe. He was friends with noted author Sir Walter Scott, who was indeed Scottish. So it's not hard to imagine that Irving was exposed to Celtic culture. We could also give credit to Irving's other possible European influences, like Tam O'Shanter by Robert Burns and The Wild Huntsman by Gottfried August Berger, both poems that have supernatural horse chases. Basically, Irving took the concept of a headless horseman from the Dullahan and added elements that would make it more frightening for his target audience, Americans. Irving uses the name of an actual town in the United
Independence, I want to round up every English person in Scotland and shoot them. No. If by that I think Scottish decisions should be made in Scotland, that Scottish people should be able to control their own economy, their own political decisions, their own defence decisions, their own foreign policy, their own welfare decisions, then aye. And we actually have to start probing what is meant by nationalism. This isn't a nationalist movement. This is a movement for self-determination. Scottish nationalism, as we understand it.
A significant part of this poem and edited and translated it has the following English rendering of those verses. My body has passed from my control and has fallen to her share. I am a body in two pieces since the lovely, bright and gentle one is gone. She was one of my 2 feet, one of my sides, her countenance like the white thorn. None belonged to her more than to me. She was one of my eyes, one of my hands. She was half of my body, the fresh torch. Harshly have I been treated, O king. I am faint as I tell it. She was the very half of my soul. The poem contains many charming details about their relationship, that they had 11 children.
No one in English Parliament directly represents the American colonist, but nonetheless the Parliament claims that it virtually represents the American colonist, just like it virtually represents various other constituencies in England itself.
When they said there should be no taxation without representation, they were citing a fundamental principle of the Enlightenment, that one had fundamental rights that inhere in the individual. Rights to one's property, one's liberty, and one's life, which cannot be infringed upon unless
English there. It's always challenging for me to organize myself in terms of a curriculum vitae in print, and certainly to do it verbally, because what I'm most passionate about are the ways in which ideas, people, events, are linked in ways that don't owe any obedience to categories or academic silos. And this is reflected in how I teach, it's reflected in what I teach, and it's very much reflected in my creative process as an artist. When I think of my
teacher and one named Susan Bedford, an English teacher, they got together and they made an explicit promise to each other that they were going to create an academic event as memorable as prom. Now let's remember, prom is the night when teenagers rent stretch limos and later vomit on each other. So this is a tall order we're talking about here. And I'm here to tell you, they succeeded. Their event starts with the author William Golding, who wrote the classic book Lord of the Flies, which paints a pretty bleak picture of human nature. It suggests that we are all savages at our core, under a thin veneer of
book. And there are sounds in English that you probably don't even hear right now because you haven't trained your ears for English. And all the grammar rules and pronunciation rules, most of which have exceptions. Now, some rules are useful and can help you learn faster, but rules are just a description of a language. You don't want to learn a description of English. You want to become a confident, fluent speaker of natural American English. So, for all of these reasons and more, I created English Hacks so that you can.
And with the advice and guidance of English Heritage, now Historic England, our conservation department did some investigations in the southern Alps.
The removal of some later overpaint led to the revelation of part of Robert Jones's original scheme for the room, which took the form of large silver palm leaves radiating across an apse ceiling. It was decided that this was sufficiently interesting that it should be pursued as a restoration project. This was done by recreating the decoration.
ايه يا طه الهبل اللي بتعمله ده؟
بظبط تكييف.
ده اي ايكو ماستر الجديد من مايديا.
تكييف شايف شغله، فيا ريت بقى نشوف شغلنا.
اتفضل شوف شغلك. الله، اتفضل شوف شغلك. ما تكبرش الموضوع. تشوف شغلك زيه. مين ده؟ مين ده؟ اتفضل شوف شغلك.
AI ايكو ماستر الجديد من ماي داي.
يعني وان كليك فول كنترول. تكييف شايف شغلك.
فنشوف شغلنا بقى.
The historic inventories list this piece as a piece of English silver, largely because they believed that it was a model of the White Tower, that is the inner keep of the Tower of London itself. Of course, when you look closely at it, you can see that it doesn't bear any resemblance to the White Tower. This piece became associated with the crown jewels, which were newly remade for the coronation of Charles II. And so it has remained on display with the crown jewels ever since.
Things that the New English brought in.
Children's literature has always had an educational emphasis then, Noreen.
Yes, it has. And Plato was one of the first to talk about it in the Republic, or our first recording of thinking about children's literature as having an educational emphasis, when he wanted the stories that children read and hear to be ones that gave them direction for the utmost excellence of character. And so we've got that sense of literature teaching children how to be.
Towards the German system, although actually the original system in English, we think, is more like the modern German system, where really what you get is it am I. And no one ever suggests now in modern English that you should say that. What we've been looking at in particular in our recent work is not just the effect of number variation, but where the two noun phrases differ in person. It's been something that's been observed particularly in the last few years. People have been documenting differences in syntactic behavior between first and second person.
Violate any fundamental condition in the grammar of English. But as Strunk goes on to talk about passives, he gets vaguer and vaguer after that rather dishonest beginning, and starts saying things like, the habitual use of the active voice makes for forcible writing. Many a tame sentence of description or exposition can be made lively and emphatic by substituting a transitive
teaching of English. Literature, we must remember, is something that gives our students wings. It talks about things that matter to young people. It gives them the possibility of being part of an alternative world and a possibility of taking off in an unknown area that they have never experienced before. So it's important, I think, for our young students today who are digital natives, whether it's on screen or in print, that they don't let literature go the way of the dinosaur, that our wider educational community and that our publishing industry,
like a little sausage and cheese pizza on English muffins. It's just fun to be in the kitchen. Christmas is beautiful, but it can be stressful. You have to be very brave sometimes to go home. You have to be very brave sometimes to welcome your family, because, you know, every family's a mix of everything. My kind of enjoyment recipe at Christmas time is anybody can do it. Light a candle, find some music, either on the radio, online, or if you know, on your phone with a.
عبور لاند مش بس الطعم الأصلي، دي اختيار الشعب المصري.
You speak English, this poem is in English, and yet you have no idea what it means. A lot of poetry begins as a secret and covert activity. So poetry is sort of a diary without the lock, a diary that you want people to read.
poem often has two subjects, the starting subject and then the discovered subject. I was as sure as a boy could be that this useless, worthless thing I wove out of boredom would be enough to make us even. The poem wants to leave the object and go beyond it into something.
And when I started speaking again, it was in full English. One of the first phrases I said as my parents showed me my orphanage photos was, "Sarah, sad." Children who are adopted often put up emotional walls to protect themselves from being hurt again. I certainly did this. And like many transracially adopted children, there were many moments growing up where I wished that I was white, like the other kids around me. Other kids made fun of my eyes and nose. Now, the 80s styles were particularly brutal to me.
In English, we tend to call people creatives if they have a certain job, like designer or architect or artist. I hate that term. I think it's offensive and exclusionary. Creativity doesn't belong to a certain group of people. A lot of my work with physicians and medical students is just reminding them that no matter what profession that we choose, we can make meaning, find beauty in the hard stuff, and create. This is medical student Pablo Romano.
My parents immigrated here from Mexico many years ago, and when I was in college, they passed.
At dawn the following day, the C-54 reached the English coast and executed a perfect landing.
This was a sample from an audiobook called The Glass Cage by Nicholas Carr. It's an audiobook that looks at the future of automation, exploring things like robots, self-driving cars, and digitized medicine. This book, along with many others, is available as an audiobook on Audible, so you can listen to it on the go, no matter where you are. On top of that, you can get your first audiobook, a 30-day free trial, and 2 Audible originals all for free by visiting audible.com/primalspace or texting primalspace.
Tactomy washed, it means yes is love in English.
But it could get even harder to talk about consent here.
The government's proposing a new law dubbed the paedophile law. It makes it a crime to talk to children about sex. Effectively, it bans sex education.
Lack of education is resulting in stigma attached to victims of rape and violence. They are not knowing their rights, they are not reporting.
I was called a paedophile several times. I was also called a murderer. I was threatened on the streets, verbally and physically.
For teaching children about sex?
Yeah.
Was that if people don't pronounce these words the way an English dictionary says you should pronounce them in received pronunciation, then you are not intelligent, you are not professional, and you are not educated. I never intended to convey or spread that toxic message, but I did convey it, and I need to apologise. I am so sorry to everyone who felt hurt by that video, and I'm so sorry to everyone who has ever been made to feel unprofessional, uneducated, or
Senior year of English, we were writing essays analyzing poetry. Freshman year of college, we were writing movie reviews. And the teacher didn't even like me. She thought I was a slacker because I was never paying attention. I didn't take community college seriously, but it was so easy, I was still getting amazing grades. On the 3rd semester of community college, I took a public speaking class. Now, I might be an introvert, but I don't have a problem with public speaking. That's part of my job now. I took the class because it would be an easy A, and I needed a communications credit for my major. I wanted to be a math teacher, and you may not have noticed, but they publicly speak all the time. So I take the class, I'm like the best person in the class, right? And for the final, we had to...
I mentioned in one of my previous videos how to use English and make friends in English, that when you find something in common with someone else, don't lose that piece of information. Tell them that you have something in common. So if you also like gardening, or if you had a garden 10 years ago, okay, share this information so that you can connect with them. Yeah, I used to have a garden and I worked really hard on it, and then when the day came to pick all of the tomatoes, I went outside and the deer had eaten all of them. This is a true story. It was very sad. But it's a way to connect because you have, maybe you're not a...
Now,
Phrasal verbs are groups of words in English made up of a verb and either one or two particles. Now, a particle can either be a preposition, like on, or an adverb, like together. To learn more about phrasal verbs, make sure you watch this video here, because here I share my top tips for learning phrasal verbs, but I'll also link to it at the end of this lesson, so you can keep watching.
They had inserts in English in major US
So this is what this was. They had an
right?
insert and it said something like, the title was just straight out of the Chinese Embassy's website or something like, Shen Yun is a blasphemy to performing arts or something like that. And it was published in the Washington Post, in the Wall Street Journal, the London Telegraph, anywhere from Melbourne, Australia to Nashville, Tennessee, all over the place, same time. And it was disguised as a regular article. So if you're just reading, oh, here's an article about Chinese culture and Shen Yun, oh, interesting, the Washington Post doesn't think it's a good show. But this is actually just something straight out of, the Politburo from Beijing. So you really have to be, but if you're looking carefully,
with Castiglione and Thomas Mallory's Morterather. But Henry VIII was the last English king to joust, while Henry II, King of France, was killed at a tournament in 1558, when the whole thing fizzled out, as the Reformation and Counter-Reformation led to the European wars of religion. Of course, none of these romantic ideas was ever intended to benefit the mass of the oppressed people whose labour maintained the warrior caste. Richard the Lionheart believed in all of this, and was a great and successful warlord to boot in the Holy Land.
English literature and literary theory.
I really enjoyed my whole experience of language learning at Warwick. The literature aspects of the degree and the language aspects in the degree never felt separate from the rest of the content. Almost as soon as you get to the stage of being able to deal with texts in the original, those texts are immediately being linked to work that you're doing in translation with other students in your regular lectures.
I chose language subjects because I'd never done them before. So my first year I did ancient Greek, and I did that for 2 years, and then I did Latin in my last year. Having that was a privilege, and I was really lucky to do that, and I loved it.
At Warwick, I created and I'm leading 2 modules.
Guy, and this guy would come around in a shopping cart and you'd honk his horn, spoke no English, and my dad would go out there and order, and it was 2 corns for $1, and I'd sit there on the curb with my dad and we'd eat it. For me, that's my cultural experience, my connection. But again, when you live all these things, that's just kind of part of who I am. I didn't realize that I was different per se. There were some things that I saw growing up with my dad that, looking back on it now, just not something that drugs really impacted my family.
It was about a sort of very upright English couple trying to get through a dinner party, and their guests not only came too early and on the wrong night, but when they were all together in the room, they found that none of them could talk coherently, and that their language sort of flew apart the minute they tried to say something. And to me, there was something so colossally familiar about this, because I grew up in a very literary family full of poets and biographers, and I can't say, as my family always, that the conversation made great sense. It was very earnest, and so when I saw this play with the Smiths and the
That year, Liverpool won their 18th English League title, and they would not win another one until 4 days ago. I didn't really become a Liverpool fan until later, when the Premier League came to American TV in the early 2000s, and by then, Liverpool were a bit down on their luck. In fact, at one point, they were close to bankruptcy. But oh, Hank, over the years, I have imagined so many times how it would feel to win the Premier League. I have imagined where I would be at the pub in Indianapolis where I watched the games with other Liverpool fans, at Anfield maybe, watching it happen live. But I didn't imagine what would actually happen, which is that Liverpool would win the league.
From one of my English teachers at Lower Merion named Mr. Fisk. He had a great quote that said, "Rest at the end, not in the middle." That's something I always live by. I'm not going to rest, I'm going to keep on pushing now. There are a lot of answers that I don't have, even questions that I don't have. But I'm just going to keep going. I'm just going to keep going, and I'll figure these things out as we go, right? And you just continue to build that way. So I try to live by that all the time.
And as an English student, it seemed obvious.
I think Beardsley would have actually got it. I think, he was very well aware of the idea of how much is it real, how much is it just fantasy.
The idea of kind of fluidity and gender and sexuality as movable, that's something that we see in Beardsley, that's something that we see in the work of drag kings and queens, with contemporary pop stars playing with masculinity and femininity. And I think dandies say things for effect. They say things to get a reaction.
Beardsley came up with wonderful ones, like, I caught cold by
Queen Victoria's chief cook, Charles Elm Franticelli, was English, but he received his culinary training in France. His culinary credentials strengthened his reputation and helped sell his cookbooks. Royals may not be culinary experts, but they are arbiters of cultural taste. Number 3. Different socio-cultural values. Courtly love, a medieval tradition idealizing a sometimes chaste love between knights and married noblewomen, originated in France. By the 14th century, courtly love was idealized in English royal courts as well. Neither French nor English lovers in the 21st century idealized chaste romantic love. However, sex and infidelity are regarded differently in British culture.
لمة الماتش دي أكيد فيها ليبتون. ليبتون يظبط أي لمة.
Taiwanese Navy. Abbreviated as the ROCN in English, the Taiwanese Navy is small in comparison to the main players in the Pacific, but what it lacks in number of ships, it makes up for in offensive punch. Its primary mission is to defend the Republic of China, and its perceived main threat to that mission is the People's Republic of China and its growing maritime capabilities. Its fleet is almost entirely foreign-built, with ships provided by the United States, France, and the Netherlands, and its main focus is on anti-ship and anti-submarine warfare. It operates submarines decommissioned from NATO navies and a fleet arm air based on land. They've also begun construction of their own submarines. No fewer than 1818 was the first year in a new series of English-led polar expeditions which continued for most of the 19th century. Among them was an expedition led by Englishman John Ross, which included a counterclockwise navigation around Baffin Bay. This also had the effect of opening the waters up to whaling ships. Though the Northwest Passage eluded him, as it did so many others over history, the boom to the whaling industry was immediate, and whalers from Great Britain and the United States were soon delivering the fine oil for illumination to ports around the world. By 1820, the effects of the year with no summer were relegated to history, a part of family lore in which elders described to children the weather events of the past. Corsets are also responsible for adding to the lexicon of the English language. The term straight-laced connotes upright morals, whereas corsetless loose women implies the opposite. It should also be noted that men are equally guilty in the dangerous quest regarding physical standards of beauty. Number 1. Crinolines. By the 1960s, crinolines, also known as panniers or hoop skirts, had reached the height of popularity for women of all social statuses. The garments also had an alarming tendency to catch fire, giving the term fashion victim an unfortunate literal meaning. The skirts were designed to exaggerate women's hips with a flattering silhouette and typically consisted of a steel-reinforced petticoat layered in fabric. Across the English Channel from France to London. Built directly into a hill, the V3 operated by a multi-charge principle where secondary charges were detonated inside the long barrel in order to further propel the artillery shell. Initial trials of the V3 took place in May of 1944 when the cannon achieved a range of 55 miles, that's 88 kilometers, and again in July they achieved 58 miles or 93 kilometers. Two of these cannons were built, but only one of them saw any action during the war. From January the 11th, 1945 until the 22nd, a total of 183 rounds had been fired on the recently liberated one of the planet's most active volcanoes. According to experts, it is the only active volcano on the European mainland. Mount Vesuvius, best known for the eruption that completely destroyed Pompeii, erupted in 1944. Number 8. The largest and smallest country in the world. Europe is home to both the smallest country in the world, Vatican City, and the largest, Russia. According to the CIA World Factbook, Russia's area comprises 17,098,242 square kilometers, while Vatican City's area is only 0.44 square kilometers. The Vatican City state is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the only site to encompass an entire state. Number 7, the Merry Ceremony in Romania. Cemeteries are often sad.
And the fact it wasn't so bad, particularly if it's in English. So those are, I think a lot of part is the fellowship and the trust that people who come to this know we're not trying to pull anything over on you. These are the facts.
So
Take
it's fun.
them and, and if these facts don't quite fit what you think, then why don't you do something about it? And that's why it's so important to me to learn.
So it's important to note that it's also fun and fellowship.
Oh, absolutely.
Because I think it's a very, very important, I can't think of the word in English, adnodd, resource. See, bilingual.
Early at it. It wasn't like I was a genius in English or anything like that.
Yes.
So along the way, self-doubt was an incredible thing. It was like, really? Is this really what because there wasn't that much positive reinforcement coming back.
Yeah.
So that was a really hard one for me in my long journey. And I think it is for a lot of people that you're just not sure.
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting point in terms of that distinction. Like, I know there are several people in my life who were very clear since the time they were little of the thing that they wanted to do. And eventually,
bestsellers. An English noblewoman is taken captive by a Viking lord, and after spending some time together, they slowly fall in love. A different English noblewoman is taken captive by a Viking lord, and after spending some time together, they slowly fall in love. A Danish noblewoman is taken captive by a Viking lord, and after spending some time together, they slowly fall in love. A French noblewoman is taken captive by the Danes, and then rescued by a Viking lord, and after spending some time together, they slowly fall in love. A Saxon noblewoman is taken captive by a Viking lord, and after spending some time together, they slowly fall in love. A Viking woman is captured by a Saxon lord, and after spending some time together, they slowly fall in love. Ooh, little reversal of roles there, I say. There
headline, you kind of think it's a British English kid and a British Muslim kid, but actually they're both British Muslim. And these are the types of headlines that we've been fed. So I wanted to kind of cement that as a part of showing the kind of evidence of what's been happening really. And with regards to the quotes in the book, these were separated. So one section would talk about masculinity, another section would talk about 9/11 conspiracy theories. And I wanted to keep it anonymous because I wanted it to be more of a
out to be Milady de Winter. Cardinal R tells her that the Duke of Buckingham has sent English troops into the French war on the side of the King's enemies. To stop this, he wants Milady to travel to London and inform the Duke that the Cardinal has evidence of his affair with the Queen, and is prepared to out her and have her arrested as a collaborator, counting on the Duke's devotion to his mistress to force him to withdraw his armies from France. If this fails, he charges Milady with the task of arranging for the Duke's assassination instead. As payment, Milady demands the heads of both Constance and D'Artagnan, who she says she can prove has visited and collaborated with Englishmen. And, I mean, she's not wrong. The Cardinal agrees to this and her final request, which is a letter.
He's a professor of English and the director of the New York State Summer Writers Institute. Welcome, Professor. Congratulations on this book.
Thank you so much.
It's one in a trend that we've hosted on The Open Mind. Bill Egginton, The Splintering of the American Mind. Our viewers and readers of our transcripts on The Open Mind are familiar, no doubt, with Jonathan Haidt's work in the same arena. But I just wanted to challenge from the outset the title, the premise, or at least ask you to flesh it out a little bit more, because can there be such a thing as a tyranny if tyranny is an omnipotent
Behind the role play of English lay a rainbow of multicultural, embedded in 150 languages, a magnetic workforce of young, skilled passengers attracted to Central,
Our labour is a major asset, mostly overlooked. I love this place, where crazy reigns above from unknown altitudes. When depression creeps up like adulthood, trying to purge the fright out of you. Places like Brixton, with no church in sight, sits the soul food served from a live band.
With Egypt, where this scene is actually set, that is very reminiscent of an English countryside. So this picture is something that obviously had more meaning in the sort of specific site for which it was probably made, and certainly the site in which it hung in the 17th century. Now, the picture hung across another painting by Orazio today in Bilbao, and beneath a glorious ceiling, an elaborate ceiling decoration also by Orazio. So it's a sort of ode to Orazio, this whole space belonging to the Queen. And this ceiling painting was his last great sort of commission in London. He died very shortly.
Recce. Converting from the English system to the metric system. Things that are nice and precise and factual and easily stated, but things that are a little bit less sharply stated, like how you open a door, machines don't understand the first thing. So there's actually a competition right now for opening doors. So somebody uploaded data sets from 500 different doors, and they're hoping that robots will experiment with all 500 doors and they'll get it. But what's more likely is they'll get to door 501 and they'll actually have a problem, or at least door number 601. So every ordinary person in the West has opened a bunch of doorknobs and
you took a very specific sort of linear progression in English and math. It's probably 60-minute sections on each subject. In high school, you probably took a year of biology, you took a year of chemistry, you had a year or two of a foreign language, right? That is, in a sense, the framework that was laid out in 1893 for what school should look like. In fact, the recommendation of the committee, they unanimously agreed that every subject should be taught to every student in the same way and to the same extent, regardless of destination. So in other words, right, every subject should be taught in the same way.
Using very quaint English expressions here. There's a certain store, there's a bush, or whatever, just things that you're very familiar with. So the first thing you've got to remember is, I don't know, I have to take my suit to the dry cleaners. And I've got to do that tomorrow. So I make an image. You have to make a bizarre image of that thing. So say a suit that is so clean, it's sort of gleaming bright white that you can barely look at it. And you attach that to this image of the mailbox. So you imagine someone's pulled that, like dressed up the mailbox in a gleaming white suit. Or is trying to stuff it in, but the light is shining out of the little slot.
That's a bunch of English colonists who are vastly outnumbered by their enslaved African workforce, and they want to be defended by the British Army. So they're forever indeed asking for a standing army to be in the islands to defend slave plantation owners against their own slaves who are constantly rebelling. And that is to some degree the same case in the southern colonies on the mainland. In the north in particular, and particularly in New England, the idea of a standing army is the worst form of political tyranny. And this
It passed through 2 more English collections, and then it was acquired by the gallery from the Earl of Suffolk in 1880. And about that time, I'll say a bit about its conservation. The panel was thinned and given the cradle, this kind of support structure, shortly after its acquisition. Now, cradles are often very problematic, but in this case, the panel has remained stable, and the cradle hasn't caused any major structural problems. The painting may have been cleaned a bit at this time, we don't know. There are references to removing some varnish on the surface in connection of dealing with treating the surface for so-called fogging or bloom.
Story they read in 9th grade English that day, or explaining how Newton's laws of motion work. But I also have students who go to the homeless shelter or to the group home. They go to the car that their family is sleeping in right now. They come to school with trauma, and when I go home every day, that goes home with me. And see, that's the hard part about teaching. It's not the grading, the lesson planning, the meetings. though sure, those things do occupy a great deal of teachers' time and energy.
They're eager to learn English, and their children serve in the U.S. military all over the world. Now, these are, of course, arguments that we hear every day. Immigrants and their advocates use them as they confront those who would deny immigrants their rights or even exclude them from society. And up to a certain point, it makes perfect sense that these would be the kinds of claims that immigrants' defenders would turn to. But in the long term, and maybe even in the short term, I think these arguments can be counterproductive.
I've been an English teacher, an attorney, a video game creator, and now a toilet paper salesman selling millions of rolls of toilet paper a year. Life is about finding the intersection of what you really, really love with what you're really, really good at. As simple as it sounds, it's really not that easy to find. After a brief stint as an English teacher, I went to law school and ended up becoming an attorney at a really big law firm here in New York City. Like most Americans, for the next 2-3 years, I was holding on to my job for dear life, working really late hours in a job that I thought maybe I was good at, but certainly not one that I really, really loved. I then came upon that epiphany that it takes years of
in English, that's hurry sickness. When we have to make fast decisions, autopilot brain kicks in, and we rely on our learned behaviors, our reflexes, our cognitive biases to help us perceive and respond quickly. Sometimes that saves our lives, right? Fight or flight. But sometimes it leads us astray in the long run. Oftentimes when our society has major failures, they're not technological failures. They're failures that happened when we made decisions too quickly on autopilot.
Very urgent. We're looking for an English teacher to start teaching next week in Busan. Basically, the pay was a little tiny bit better, the hours definitely better, and the location right in the center of Busan, which is where all my friends live. So immediately, on my break, I spent like the only few minutes I had emailing him back saying I'm interested, like I'd like to do an interview. And they actually wanted to see me in person. So, like the next, I think it was like 2 days later, I went in for an interview. I went to meet with the director and the assistant director, and I told them, yeah, I'm looking for a new job. It didn't really work out at my school, and they asked me why, and I was.
The city is strongly bilingual when compared to other Canadian cities, and English and French are both spoken here commonly. It is one of the liveliest areas in North America, and there are plenty of things to see and do all over this sprawling city. Before we get into the top 10 things to do in Montreal, we've included links in the description to various discount codes and links to resources of things to do, so make sure you check those out. At number 10, explore the Old Port. The Old Port is a historic port of Montreal that sits along the waterfront and stretches for over 2 kilometers along the St. Lawrence River. The port dates back to 1830, but since then, it has been redeveloped.
The understatement and a lot of the irony of English comedy, of English writing, and I've been aware of this actually for a very long time. It's almost like a weight which I cannot quite carry. How the social structure is soaked into the bones and into the language. I don't mean it's snobism. I think there's just ways of negotiating what there is. And I've always kind of felt, this is a slightly romanticized thing, that essentially I'm a Budapest tenement building in a London suburb. It's kind of, you can see, you can do it, you can put the building there.
The encouragement of English heritage, now historic England, was very important. They really thought that a full restoration of the saloon would be a feasible project. And this restoration has been possible partly because of the number of in-house staff working on it. I mean, Anne Sowden, who is now retired, devoted hours and hours and hours and hours of her time, which if we were paying for an external contractor would have sort of bankrupted the institution. She had also developed an awful lot of in-house expertise, which an outside contractor might not have.
The English army was bigger, better equipped, and more experienced. However, they lost to the fiercely determined Scots. The Battle of Bannockburn is an incredible interactive adventure that will change what you think about Scottish history and shake you up with a realistic 3D battle experience. as you come face to face with soldiers, knights, and pages on both sides of the conflict. Witness the sights and sounds of battle, take your place in the battle room, and see ancient battle strategies, weapons, and armor. Harnessing state-of-the-art 3D technology, visitors can experience medieval combat like never before to learn about this crucial event in Scottish history. The centre also contains an award-winning cafe and gift shop, Created in the 18th century, the English Garden is a large public park in the centre of Munich, stretching from the city centre to the northeastern city limits. At 370 hectares, this expanse of lawns, tree groves, pasture, waterways, and a lake is one of Europe's largest urban parks. There is 78 kilometers of hiking and jogging trails, a Japanese tea house, many traditional beer gardens, and much more for visitors to enjoy. At number 4 is Allianz Arena Tour. Visitors can get behind the scenes at this major sports venue, perfect for football fans visiting Munich. The Allianz Arena boasts a capacity of 75,000 and laid out in the French and English style, with shady nooks, pools, and fountains. The shaded walkways provide a sanctuary from the powerful sun. Number 7 is Carrera del Darro. Beneath the Albaicin district is Carrera del Darro, a street that traces that flows through the city where the old walls would have been. The street is nice for a scenic walk and can taper to just a couple of meters wide in places. All the while, you'll have splendid views of